So a very warm welcome to this BA community webinar. We're discussing a really important topic today around backlog management. Perhaps you've been in a situation where you've inherited a backlog that is huge. Perhaps you found yourself in that pattern where, everyone's just adding another user story to the backlog, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and everyone knows that it's it's this big monstrosity, but no one will ask the difficult questions. Or maybe you've been in the opposite situation where you start to feel a bit like a user story factory because there are so many devs. And it's like, well, look, we just need to feed the devs. We need to feed the devs, create some user stories. If any of those things apply to you, then you're in the right place. Even if they don't, if you want to know more about backlog management, you are definitely in the right place. We have two phenomenally knowledgeable speakers, Lynn Girvan. So Lynn is CMC Partnership Consultancy's head of Agile Business Analysis. You may well have read one of Lynn's books or articles or seen her speak at one of the many conferences she's spoken at. Mick comes with a unique background covering the British Army and UK Special Forces, as well as, of course, in consulting. Mick is head of change and transformation at CMC, and in fact has a background in complexity and change as well. And one thing I know about you randomly, Mick, from LinkedIn is you're a beekeeper, which
I am a beekeeper. I'm doing a talk at the conference as well on beekeeping and business analysis and what one can teach the other. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, yeah, and I imagine there's a whole thing about complexity and self-organization in bees, but we're not going to start that conversation because we'd be here all day. So just before we kick off, it's worth saying that, of course, you can ask your own questions. Please ask the questions in the Q&A tab. Keep chatting with each other in the chat tab. That's fine. But when you have questions, put them in the Q&A tab. Also, I just want to mention, and I'll share my screen very briefly, you should be seeing the website for the BA Conference Europe there. Both Lynn and Mick are speaking at the Business Analysis Conference Europe, which takes place on the 18th to 20th of September 2023. If you go to the IRM UK website, you can see that. There is a fantastic agenda of there's 5 or 6 tracks of brilliantness there. So do check that out and take a look and consider going, whether you're in London or near, or whether you can get there. But let's get started with some questions. So if we think about backlogs getting created, we've probably all come across backlogs that are full of, I can't think of a better word for it, junk. Backlogs full of junk. And that could imply a lack of discipline in backlog maintenance going right back to inception, right back to when the backlog was first created. So I'm going to ask a really tricky question to start with. How should backlogs get created? Lynn, what's your view on that?
Well, they're not requirements catalogs, I think, is the first thing I want to say.
What, you mean it's not just a BRD and Jira?
Well, and I think this is a problem, actually. I think people do create them as a business requirements document and then stick it in Jira. If you're doing that, you're not being agile, right? The whole point of a backlog is to be agile. It's to consider just-in-time analysis. It's to consider just-in-time requirements. So I think, it's really important that backlog should define the work that needs to be done. And also, even more accurately, the work that needs to be done now. Everything else is context. Everything else is concepts and ideas. So we want to get the backlog streamlined enough so we're focusing the backlog on maybe, you could argue a 0 to 3 month window. I personally like to use now, next, future roadmaps, where now is looking at the now window of the things that we're looking over the next 3 months. I don't like to put timeframes on roadmaps particularly, but I think it's helpful. So next is then the things that you'll be doing next. And then the future is stuff that not now, but we'll be doing in the future. And I think use those as dumping grounds, but don't elaborate any of that. Just to hold them down as themes. They're just general things, because if we go back to the days of waterfall and requirements documents, probably on average 40% of those requirements ever got delivered. That means 60% of that was waste. We try to embrace lean concepts in Agile as well. So we don't want all of that waste coming into the backlogs. So I think that the elaboration and what we could call inception work and all of that discovery work should be done outside of the backlogs. And then, then we look at prioritization and things like that to prioritize what goes into the backlog. And we focus the backlog on, items in the roadmap that are in the now column, things that are elaborated, and hold information about those things down to definition of ready, i.e., we know that they're ready for a development team to work on them, and they've had some of the critical policy things considered around them, and it's done just in time. Anything you do at that level of detail and you put in a backlog will just go out of date. It'll just go out of date and it'll need to be done. So you have to rework it, and you're creating inventory for yourself and creating a lot of lean waste. So we need to try and avoid that.
It's really interesting, Lynn. So if I'm understanding you correctly there, you're in my view, very sensibly, and I agree, advocating some work outside of the backlog to actually figure out, like, broadly what the thing is, right? And that's not saying the detail of the thing, it's just what the thing is. I've heard the analogy before. It's like, are we building foundations for, a one-story building or a 100-story skyscraper? So it's sort of, you don't necessarily need to know the color of the paint in the boardroom, but you sort of need to know broadly what the product is. Is that the sort of thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, and you can sketch out, and we'll probably come on to this as we go into more detail around some of the backlogs, but you can sketch out big chunks of business enablers. So you can say things like, well, we'll do this first, and then we'll do that, and then we'll do that, but this is the stuff we're going to do now. You elaborate that stuff, and you still don't deliver all of that because you need to then prioritize it. I think we think about, when we look at a backlog, we think if we've written something down and we've got a backlog of 10,000, work items or user stories, we think that gives us certainty that we know what we're actually doing. But that doesn't give you certainty at all, because nothing in there is certain. In fact, the only thing that is certain in projects today, especially in the knowledge work that we do, is that, there is always more work to do than we've got time and money for. So don't try and cram all that in a backlog. And nobody ever said, right, here's a brand new requirement, here's a new requirement, go and check your 10,000 requirements just in the off chance you thought about it a year ago. Nobody cares. So, don't try to manage that. Leave all of those things as big pieces of work that are coming later, and focus on the detail now. Don't focus on the detail later. You'll get cluttered with it all. Use your book backlog to guide the work that's going to be built, and use roadmaps and other things to guide the rest of the work and provide that context.
That's really interesting. And actually, as you were talking there, Lynn, and Mick, if I maybe bring you in here on a bit of a tangent, but I was thinking about, albeit probably my naive understanding of complexity, I was thinking that actually, it's probably fair to say that a lot of projects are done in an environment where there are elements of complexity, and I'm not going to get into what that means and different domains of complexity and stuff, but actually, presumably, if you're in a situation where there's lots of change happening around you, then you've sort of got to be able to respond to that change, right? Would you say that like complexity plays a part in that?
Yeah, I think, like Lynn said, it's I think people, if they write stuff down or they put stuff on a backlog, and it gives them this it's like this veneer of certainty, isn't it? But actually, what's going on is, when things are complex, it's very uncertain. That doesn't mean that it's harder to work when it's like that. You've just got to work in a slightly different way. And I mean, there's lots of different angles you can go down with the complexity stuff. But when we were coming on this, I just did a little bit of looking into where actually that word comes from, backlog, right? And I read this a while ago, and I've tried to do some fact checking on it. So, and some sites sort of say, yeah, that's where it's from. Some others, but a lot of it goes back to, like, it was a shipping term. I don't know if anybody else has heard this, and it's like from shipping and nautical industry, and where people literally would, or sailors, they had like a plank of wood at the back of a ship, and it's where they would record information, things like how far they had traveled, the course they had taken, and other details that they would log on a journey. So you can imagine if when you're doing that back in the 17th century, you're only going to put on there stuff that's relevant. And it seems now, if we were doing that, if we were working a bit more like that, putting the relevant stuff down, because if they were doing what we do now back then, they would have probably run out. They would have nowhere to record all this stuff. So they were only putting down the stuff that really was important for the journey, you know, that they were on at that time.
That's really interesting, and actually a really suitable analogy. So it's almost like we just need to make sure it's got what's relevant for the journey that the team's going on at for the particular time that they are. So excellent. I just want to bring in some questions from the audience, and just a reminder, please do keep the questions coming. If you are able to put them in the Q&A rather than the chat tab, then it'll make them easier for me to find here. So I see a few on the chat which I will try and pick up, but if you put them in the Q&A tab, I'll be able to see them easier. So a couple of similar questions which I'm going to roll together. So Elizaveta asks, where do you recommend storing all the ideas, questions, possible improvements in order to keep the backlog clear? And also a second person asks, do you park the next and future concepts outside of the backlog in something like a document or spreadsheet? So Lynn, how would you address those two?
So yes is the answer. I would do them outside of there. So first of all, to go into we are agile, or our requirements user stories. Requirements are contractually, they should be a contractual arrangement that you're going to do something. Ideas and concepts are not. So there's no sense putting them in a backlog. So I would, use a spreadsheet if you want. Other things I've used, if you're using Jira, you might have Confluence. Usually that comes with the whole package. So I might hold things in Confluence, and you can link the Jira tickets in there. Or I wouldn't recommend that, but you can link them in there once they get made into now, next, future. So I've used Confluence to hold that information, and then as I move it into the next column, then I might assign it into a Jira ticket, so you can actually show that connection between them. There's another tool called ProPad. I don't know if anyone's come across that. That links to Jira as well as you move things. It's a roadmap tool or road mappy tool. The other thing, if you really just want to keep ideas and concepts, use something like Mural or Miro. They work really well for ideas. You can move them around really easily. You can create now, next, future columns. You can have them as big things or small things. You can put them together under categories like themes, so you connect ideas that are related. So yeah, I would do that, and then that gives you a good view of where you are. Things will drop off that though. Things just become not important.
Yeah. I want to bring in another question, actually, and I see in the chat that Elizaveta said, "Thank you very much, Lynn. You've confirmed that I'm doing something right." So that's great. It's good when there's agreement and consistency. So Oksana asks a question, and this is probably one that's on lots of people's minds, right? Question for an agile project with a deadline for MVP, so minimum viable product, and an extensive scope. Interesting. Can you give tips on how to prepare a backlog at the beginning of the project detailed enough for estimation and planning to meet the deadline? Now, I might be extrapolating here, but it sounds perhaps like Oksana's in a situation where it's like we want to be agile, but we also want fixed deadlines, so we want to know how much it's going to cost up front, and you've got an MVP, but also an extensive scope.
So I think you're in a difficult situation because if we look at the iron triangle or the quality triangle, it's based on time, cost, money, or resource. If all of those three things can't move, then you can't be agile. What agile does actually is it flips that triangle around a little bit, and it says, with this amount of time, which is your MVP deadline, and with this amount of money, that's your resource, how much of this scope can I deliver? Sorry, I should have said scope, time, cost and time. So that's what, so really what you're saying is how much scope can I deliver within the deadline that you've given me? Then the way to get there is to start looking at things like business use cases, breaking that down, identifying the functionality within there, look at customer journeys, look at the different features within those, maybe look at value streams. You can use techniques like playing good, better, best against features. So you say, given this feature, what would good look like for this feature? What would make it better? So you're not gold plating everything. So you strip everything back to get to minimum viable. Otherwise, you'll get your devs really trying to gold plate everything, and they'll try and do the best job of everything. They'll be future proofing every bit of architecture they're putting in place for the MVP, whereas actually you want to scale all that stuff right the way back. And really with an MVP, you're testing a hypothesis, you're testing that you want that feedback, you're testing that what you've got is the right stuff to do. And maybe you're even testing technical architecture and things in there, but most of all, you're testing whether what you've got is valuable, hence the V, the value part as well in there. So it's got to be viable.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because like a word I heard a lot in your answer there was test, right? And almost and test implies almost hypothesis, right? An MVP is a hypothesis of value, is one definition that we could take. And I suppose it's about testing stuff, or testing throughout, right? You test on paper. A test might be a context diagram. Is this broadly the sort of thing that we're looking at? So starting with those sorts of artifacts, perhaps. Mick, anything to add?
God blimey, it's that the interesting thing, isn't it? It's the question's gone now, but somebody wants an MVP, but then they want all this again. They want these certainty things, and then when you start hearing that talked about, it becomes quite confusing. I think, if you're a BA, so like you said up front, Adrian, I sort of head up the change and transformation part, but me and Lynn are constantly going on to people about how important it is to have BAs and change people working together. And we hear this all the time. I want an MVP, but can you tell me exactly when you're gonna deliver it? Can you tell me exactly what it's gonna do? And straight away, if you're going to be delivering MVP, you're sort of leaning towards a sort of, this is probably going to be a little bit more complex than we thought it might be. So you're going to be doing experiments and you're going to be learning as you go. And I think it's really hard for people to be told, look, I'm going to give you something, but I can't tell you exactly what it is I'm going to give you to begin with and exactly when you might get it. And so trying to do some of the upfront conversations and building trust around that sort of stuff, I think is really important. Sometimes gets overlooked. People just go into these things and then you start working in an agile way. And if the organization or the people you're working with aren't really set up to work like that, it's blimmin' difficult to get going.
Yeah. And I don't know if you'd both agree, but one thing I've learned with working with different organizations is whenever I hear MVP, I've learned to ask, when you say MVP, what does MVP mean here? Because it can mean anything from literally the minimum we can do to create an experiment through to what would have been called phase one in a waterfall environment. And anything in between those, right? So
and worth adding as well, the minute you've got a fixed scope, whether that's an MVP scope or not, you're sort of pushing the boundaries of whether you're being agile at all, because fixed scope actually lends itself to then trying to do the requirements up front to meet that scope. Your MVP might be 3 months, but you've now squashed it into a mini waterfall. So scope shouldn't be fixed. The thing that should be fixed in agile is the time and the amount of money resource that you've got.
So you're almost then moving into, perhaps it might be incremental, but it's not agile sort of thing. So I think it's Alan Kelly, who I'm sure I've heard him say something before, like the cost of putting something in the backlog's really low, right? So if someone says, oh, I want this, you say, oh yeah, I'll put it in the backlog, right? The cost is really low. The cost of saying that's a non-starter. The cost of having the difficult decisions, like that's a non-starter, it's never going to happen, is actually quite high, because you potentially have to have some quite bold and difficult conversations. What role do you think prioritization plays in keeping the backlog clean? And do you agree with, although I'm quoting Alan from memory, do you agree with that idea that hard conversations are actually part of it? Like, you have to have those hard conversations.
Absolutely, 100%. Me and Alan have had some great conversations over the years on these sorts of things, and I would be so bold as well to say, if it's not prioritized yet, don't even put it in the backlog. Leave it in as an idea and concept, because it's not actually a requirement yet. The other thing is things creep into the backlog as well, and they were a priority and they have gone in, and like things come in as a priority, and then you might do some elaboration, and that feature now is 3 stories, say, and those 2 stories are still hanging around. If they've not been prioritized, for 3 months, 6 months, just get rid of them. Important stuff will always bubble to the surface. Always. It's one of the little guarantees. Important stuff will always come to the surface. So prioritization is not a one-off exercise. In Agile, every time you break something down to the next level, I call it decomposition, and I call it goal decomposition. You start with a big goal, which is a strategic goal of what you're trying to achieve. You break that down into smaller goals. They might be iterations, releases, prototypes, MVPs. You look at what you're going to put into an MVP, you break those down into smaller goals. They might be broken down by business use cases, system use cases, their goals in their own right. You break that down, you reprioritize them, you break those down into maybe each scenario becomes an epic or a feature or a story. You break those down. Then for each feature, you do good, better, best. You break that down. At every level, you do your elaboration work and you break stuff down into a smaller chunk. You need to reprioritize it, because I can guarantee if you break one big thing down, you'll end up with 500 requirements, and you don't need to do that. Follow the threads and just break down the stuff to the stuff that you want to minimize the impact of trying to do a full elaboration over things that just aren't needed. So, Moscow prioritization, people associate Moscow with like a waterfall approach. Actually, Moscow is an iterative approach. Moscow doesn't make sense if you only do it once, because there would only ever be must and should. So you'd never need to do it. But Moscow is an iterative prioritization mechanism. So I would use Moscow along a lot of stuff, and you don't use Moscow against the whole of the project. You use Moscow for the smaller goals that you're trying to achieve. So once you break the goal down into a smaller thing like an MVP, then you prioritize work against that MVP and so forth. And that allows Moscow to be really, really iterative. And then when you get it down to feature level, I use good, better, best then. I think that's a good way of trying to understand how much you're trying to achieve in that, rather than using Moscow at that level.
Yeah, no, I really like that, and that is a is a counteracts that situation that we've probably all seen, where you get a backlog that is incoherent. It's lots of separate things, because if you've got that coherent referential up to the goal, because you've been decomposing goals, then actually it all joins together to something. Rather than if you as I've seen sometimes, where it started at a bottom level and you just ask everyone what they want, and it's like this Santa's wish list of stuff. So you've got that sort of coherence. So excellent. I want to weave in a few more questions, because there are lots of questions in here. So Ryan asks, what do you think about Jeff? I may be mispronouncing his surname, but Jeff Gottelf's talk on outcome-based product planning.
Ryan works for us, so thank you, Ryan, for that. And I was laughing when I saw that question. It's funny actually, because I was reading there's a guy called John Smart that I follow on LinkedIn. I don't know if he's written a book, and he does a lot of stuff on scaled agile and business agility. And he posted something just this week, and it said activity doesn't equal output, and output doesn't equal outcome. And I love that, because it's so true. If we so I agree with that sentiment in there. Is outcomes are what we're trying to achieve, and that's why I always focus on goals. So I could have I could have a backlog full of stuff, but if that stuff isn't delivering anything that we can say is valuable, to a consumer, and I say the word consumer because there are different types of consumer, then we ought to not be, it's not really doing the agile job very well. I work on so many big programs where they've been working for 2 years, multiple years on stuff, and they're delivering technical enablers, and they're looking at all these architectural things, but there's nothing really in the hands of the users that's tangible. And I think this is a good point to say, we need to think about what we mean by value. And I think in this context, and Mick will have something to say about this, I'm sure, but the whole concept of value in use, until it's in the user's hands and they're using it, they can't tell you whether it's valuable. So everything you're doing up until the point that they've got it in their hands and they can actually say whether it's valuable is just an idea or concept. It hasn't been idealized yet. It hasn't been made true or realized. The outcome is actually in the hands of the consumer when they're using it. And the quicker we can get things into the hand of the consumer and get that feedback loop to say that it was valuable, then the more confidence we have that the next things that we're going to do are right. And that's how we need to get that backlog working from the very, very start. If we try to front load that by saying this whole MVP and we'll agree this scope and this scope will be of value, what often happens is tech gets built and then it sits on a shelf, or worse still, it's useful, but nobody can use it because nobody's done any of the business change either. So I think there's an area for Mick to come in near here.
Yeah.
There's definitely the getting it to customers and getting them, telling you if they get value from it from a change perspective is really, really interesting, because unless someone's using something, you never understand if, do they have the knowledge and ability to actually do it. So, and we can guess around that, but you have to give it to people. And I think sometimes we spend so long trying to come up with the perfect technical solution or the perfect thing that we might be doing in a dev team, and think, oh, we can't give that to anyone because for us it's not exactly what we want as this team. And you just prolong that, and then people who think they're receiving something get a little bit more frustrated because they don't get a chance to use anything, and then you get in this just little bit of a vicious cycle around, oh, we've been here before, someone's promised me things in the past, I haven't got it again. And then the whole fatigue around the change side of this then comes in. The quicker you can get stuff to people, the better, because you're going to get real honest feedback. And how on earth are you actually going to make improvements on stuff if you don't do that? We don't want to be 2 years down the line and then give it to people and find out that it's absolute rubbish, do we?
Absolutely. And actually, on a similar note, Mick, there's a question that's been asked, an anonymous question, which says, my organization is guilty of like, the business has an idea, we put it on the backlog. How can we begin to change views around working more towards what you were talking about? So idea boards, roadmaps. I feel it would be great, but there'd be resistance. Is there, any advice or a well-proven example? So I think this is a little bit around hearts and minds in a way, isn't it, Mick? So I mean, how would you recommend like changing people's attitudes towards, dealing with more uncertainty in a way?
Yeah, well, I think there's so many I don't know, ingrained ways of doing this stuff in organizations. And if you're one of these people that sort of goes to someone and then says, I'll tell you what about if we put a transformation wall up in one of the offices, and maybe we do things slightly differently. If the where you work isn't used to that, again, you're going to get a little bit of pushback. But if they're brilliant, those things for transparency, because else, and it takes away the burden. And I know it seems ridiculous, but it's easier for someone to walk into a room and look at a wall and see everything that's going on than it is for someone to sit down and have to click something 5 times to find something, sometimes in Jira or Confluence. All right, they're great During and Confluence are great tools, but a lot of people don't like them. So it's trying to find those little bits that actually work for the organization. And do you know what? You can do multiple things. It's like Lynn said. I mean, who thought before lockdown that mural was going to be such a big thing? I mean, most organizations now, that's their go-to way of displaying information. So I think you've just got to get, again, it's building up the trust and confidence that just because we're going to do something slightly differently,
Yes.
that's a good thing.
Yeah. Fantastic. So I want to pivot the conversation. We'll come back to, I know there are some more questions coming in the Q&A. We'll come back to those, but I just want to pivot to two topics which I think are often mentioned, but often confused and conflated terms, which is definition of ready, or DOR, and definition of done, or DOD. So how would you define definition of ready, definition of done, and like why and when are they important?
So I use these all the time, and in the book, my recent book that was published, was it this year, last year? I can't remember actually, but the Agile from First Principles, there's a really good definition in there that you might want to use. But definition of ready is really a set of value criteria that needs to be in place. There you go. That needs to be.
It's always at arm's length, you see.
Pleased to see that. So it's a value focused criteria that needs to be in place before work can commence on a work item. And I think that's important. What do you need to do before work can? So what you're trying to do is, once the team gets hold of it and they do work of it, you don't want to have those gotchas in there that means they can't complete the work within the iteration. So you need to think about what those things are. So definition of ready is getting it into place before. That could be things like accreditation processes, policies, agreed release approaches, business change considerations. Completing something that no one really is expecting, means that it can be implemented. So I think that's the definition of ready. We often, I usually have a set of criteria when I'm working within the development teams and with BAs, where we actually articulate what we mean by definition of ready. And again, we work collaboratively with the BAs and the dev teams, and we understand what that stuff is, because the dev teams will know what those gotchas are. They know what the things are that are going to stop them in their tracks. And so, the BAs can actually work with them to try and make sure that path is sort of a mask through the definition of ready. Definition of done is a set of criteria really that ensures the quality characteristics of the work item once it's completed, and in order to get sign off that it's being completed. So it would be, does it do what it said it was going to do on the tin? Does it meet the quality characteristics around the non-functionals? And maybe that'll be a question that comes up. Has it been tested? Does it meet the customer goal in the actual story? And sometimes if these tasks get broken down too small inside an iteration, then actually it's the sum of the tasks that need to be tested to meet the customer goal. So if you've got like a feature, sometimes people take in features and it gets broken down into sort of tasks rather than stories. Then actually it's the sum of those parts that needs to be tested in terms of definition of done.
That's really interesting. And actually just bringing Mick into this, springboarding from that, I'm thinking about like some elements, some stories, not necessarily individually, but in groups, or potentially there's going to be elements of change management, right, or business readiness, in terms of making sure the business are actually ready to absorb the change. And that might be as simple as as simple in inverted commas as making sure the users have been trained, or that at least someone's communicated that this thing's happening. Would you see anything like that in a definition of done, or is that completely outside the definition of done in your experience, Mick?
It's not a really, I mean, those definitions I would definitely say fit. You don't really hear those definitions talked about in change that much where I am. But again, this is where it's important that you have to work. If you're working with a BA, or a BA that's doing this type of stuff, is you have to get in there and try and understand what these terms mean, because then it's easier to convey things to people as these things may be ready, but the things may not actually have been done yet for people to use. I mean, I've just walked over and took out. This is a definition of ready, right? That's a honeycomb there, right?
Oh wow!
Which I took off the bees at the weekend. So that's a definition of ready. That is, because that's ready to be extracted into honey in a jar. And my definition of done is when that's extracted, which takes a lot of time and effort to get from that to a jar of honey. That's the definition of done. And as Lynn was speaking, that was just going through. That's why I went off and took it actually out of the soup over there, because I was thinking that's what it's like. It may be ready, but until you've got that honey in a jar, it's not done and in a state to give to people.
But actually, I think just to add to that, and one of the things that I've done with devs is I've said to them, like, who's going to write the release notes for this when we go out? Who's going to do that? And in terms of Mick's analogy, knowing that you have the jars to put the honey into might be part of the criteria that you would put into the definition of done. Have we got the jars sterilized? Do we have the jars? Do I have labels printed? All of those things. And so I think you can work with the team that are going to do the transformation from definition of ready to definition of done to say, well, at what point are we done? And there isn't any, we've got it to that point, and there might be things that need to be in place. So I think it's really, really important to consider all of those things.
Absolutely. I love the idea of almost having that as a discussion and co-create, it's sort of co-agreeing it and so on. So a few people are asking in the chat and around the and directly in Q&A and DM about the title of the book. I've typed it in the chat, but Agile from First Principles. So I'll hold up here. It's published by BCS Publishing. So Agile from First Principles is the book there. So I'll get back to the questions. So Michelle says, Adrian's description of feeding the devs is very familiar, where the BA is under pressure to keep multiple devs fed with work. What could this be a symptom of, and what would you recommend to address it? Tricky question.
This is all about pipeline. So I always look at horizon scanning and taking things down the pipeline. To be honest, Michelle, and it's nice to see you on here. I think having a now, next, future roadmap really helps with that, because the now, next, future roadmap helps you think about the elaborations that come down that pipeline. In an ideal world, the devs would get involved in that. And when we do like sprint planning, if you do big room planning, or if you're using safe criteria PI planning, then you would start looking not only about what you're doing, but what would be coming next as well. And then the BAs can start working on those things. So I think I get a bit irritated sometimes when the devs sort of outsource all of that to the BAs. In a true self-organizing team, they would be part of doing that, because otherwise they become so disconnected from the problem space that they're just a factory of churning out code, and they don't really understand what it is they're building. And there was a great phrase that Mike Cohn uses in his book, which is User Stories Applied. He says, those that build the software must collaborate and communicate with those that will use it. And I always promote that. And I think, going back to my other book, actually, The Agile BA, which me and Deborah are just writing the second edition of, he's going to stretch out. Fabulous. The role of the Agile BA isn't to do everything for the developers. It's actually to facilitate the collaboration with the development team through to those stakeholders that they need to speak to. So what I do is I think, we need to engage the development teams in the big picture, in the context, understanding the roadmap, look at their concerns, because there's always a business side to it and there's always a technical side to it. You can't avoid that. There's always going to be big technical enablers and architecture things that end up being constraints. And there's always going to be big change things from a business perspective that can end up being constraints as well. And you have to marry those. So I think the BA role has to get involved in all of that and work through that. But having a roadmap allows you to have what I call a funnel for a pipeline. And as you prioritize it, your funnel gets smaller and smaller. And the elaboration work is elaborating and understanding it. So that pipeline becomes a fluid set of agreed things through the now, next, future lens. and the wider context that should be understood in terms of, you know, what problem is it trying to solve for that business.
It's interesting, and this is a long time ago. I remember reading this, so I might be conflating the authors, but I think Ellen Gottesdiener and possibly Mary Gorman, I can't remember, but had essentially discovery and delivery is almost like a Mobius strip or two gears or something, and it's like you've got to have them synchronized, right? And if one is going faster than the other, then you're going to create inventory somewhere, or you're either going to create a lack of, and it comes back to that almost like that lean idea of flow, isn't it? I mean, we're back to lean again, we're back to Toyota. But I did try and I was trying to reach for the other book, but I think I've got it in Kindle version, so I can't show there we go, excellent. So Agile and Business Analysis, that one by Lynn and Deborah Paul.
But I should say a new second edition of this is coming out in May next year, so but feel free to get this one. It's probably cheap now because the new one's coming out. There's another YouTube clip somewhere if somebody wants to try and find it. It's Henry Nyberg does a really good video scribe of how it's the role of the product owner actually, but he talks about that flow of funneling the requirements down and that cycle of how it works around the product owner role. And I think it's a really good illustration of how you can feed the devs, Michelle. So it's a really good video if anybody picks up on that. But Mick is actually has been working really closely with Nigel Thurlow, isn't it, on flow. So
so it's the reason I sort of went out of shot then and leant across is because I literally went and picked the book up.
I knew you were
Fantastic.
going to,
because
fantastic book.
It's and I'm working with Simon, Lynn's husband Simon on some of this stuff, but it's been brilliant. I mean, the flow system is based around those three things about complexity thinking, team science, and distributed leadership. Right. So and their hypothesis and in the book is that without those three things, you're not going to produce the flow through the system to actually get a decent end result. And if the feed in the dev thing is quite interesting, it's like the what is the unintended outcome of doing that, right? Because
yes.
I think about this as well from a sort of a change angle. So I'm thinking about, right, what's happening at the other end of that. All right, you could feed the dev team constantly, but then you multiply that across large organizations, right? That's one team. It could be 10 teams, it could be 20 teams, it could be 50, I don't know. And they're all getting fed like this, and the churn out of stuff to people can be massive, but all you're seeing is you just continually feeding one team. But you multiply that across a whole network, the change implications for that at the other end can be quite disastrous. So I think this is where, again, you need to really think about how from a business analysis perspective, a change perspective, you are connected in with all these other people, and you're trying to do your best so you're not producing so much stuff at the other side, which I don't know how much of it's going to be used.
I actually had an example of this. One of the programs I was working with, and we moved into feature teams away from component teams to get them delivering faster, after having about 18 months of really lack of delivery. So we implemented agile ways of working. We put in a big BA team. We had one product backlog. We had feature teams. Everyone was working together. We did PI planning, and you know what? It was working really, really well. What happened though is we ended up delivering so much so fast that we saturated the business, and they went stuck. And I think that's an exact example of what Mick was saying. It has to be a balance between all of those things.
It absolutely. That's a really, really nice example. So we're gonna switch tracks a little bit now, and we're gonna do like quick fire questions to get as many of the questions in our question backlog covered as we can in the time that we have left. So I am going to choose. So an anonymous attendee asks. And this is probably one for Mick, I would imagine. How do you prepare the organisation that's traditionally always used waterfall to embark confidently on the agile journey? So I guess Mick and Lynn, you'll probably have a view on that.
Well, I mean, I'd ask him the question of, do you really need to do it? I think, you know, if that's worked, if that works for your organization, the waterfall thing, you know, the waterfall, it always gets a bit of a bad rep, doesn't it? But do you know what? In the right context, in the right situation, that may be the way that you want to do your work. So I literally I would start with that question. Do you actually have to change from that to work in an agile way? Because, you know, depending on the size of your, well, in fact, forget how big your organization is, that is not going to be an easy thing. And it's the thing that's actually the least time, effort, resource, money goes into setting up an organization to be able to work like that. And you know, the next thing you hear 2 weeks in is yeah, we're going to use safe.
Yes,
when no one's got any, you know.
Yeah. And yeah, fantastic. So a great and in fact Wilco has just added in the chat a switch from waterfall to agile as a project as such. And I'd agree with that, Wilco, and I'd go even further to say it's a transformational cultural change in many situations. Excellent. So I want to bring in a question. This is probably one for you, Lynn, from Esther. And Esther says DOR, so definition of ready, is considered by many or some or many as an agile anti-pattern, since it can be a bad gateway to initiate the work. What is your opinion on this?
I haven't seen it used as an anti-pattern. My only experience of it has been useful, because I think what happens is the BAs that are sort of doing a lot of the elaboration work, it forces them to have that conversation with the development team about when is ready. So there's an element of, you know, is this enough information? You know, so it forces that conversation between the business analysts, you know, maybe the product owners and the development team about, do you need me to get anything more before we can take this into a sprint? So I've not seen it as an anti-pattern. You know, and actually the book Agile from First Principle is full of anti-patterns, by the way. So if you like anti-patterns,
deliberately, you should say deliberately, they're called out.
We deliberately call them out because I think people always say about what to do in Agile, not what to do. So we deliberately try to call that out, but that's not something I've seen as an anti-pattern.
Fantastic. So, and then just some comments that people have added in the Q&A. So Wilco says DoD, so definition of done, tells us something about how well the product is implemented, which is a good observation to make. If you've got a good DoD, then that's useful. We've also, and Wilco also says that discover and deliver, which I think is the thing I was referencing, is by Ellen Gottensteiner. So thank you for Googling that. It's always difficult when I'm running these things to look these things up. Here's a really interesting question, and I'll put this out to Lynn or Mick, either of you that wants it, from Jacqueline. And Jacqueline says, is there a space or a need for a product manager and a business analyst in product development?
It depends on the product. So I always, you know, I mean, we even have this argument with the PO role as well. I think it depends on whether you're in a cost center or a profit center. So I mean by a profit center is an organization that's making products and selling them to general public versus an organization that's delivering or developing internal products to be consumed internally by the organization to deliver services that they deliver, you know, like government sector, things like that. And, you know, I think that, you know, what we need to look at is rather than focus on role titles, is look at, you know, the skills that are needed. And, you know, product managers are really, you know, have got a lot of marketing capability and stuff to consider. I think, you know, that they're looking at things from a different perspective than the BA. I think trying to get a BA to do all of that while actually considering the elaboration of the work, you know, getting things into the backlogs, you know, understanding the wider context, thinking of all that. And in some ways, the product manager feeds that. So I think there is a need for the roles, and I think there is a need for a role separation. However, saying that, if you're in a very small team and the product isn't very big, then no, there's one person can do all of those things, but that person will be wearing 3 different hats. So we need to be different. We need to separate role from person. If a person is capable of doing multiple roles and has the time to do both of those roles as one person, and it works, and they can do it because they've got the time, and it's not too big. As it becomes bigger, it's better to compartment those things and have different individuals in those roles to maintain, I call it the critical friend, that argument between, are we doing that? Are we doing that? I always think my role as a BA is the critical friend. I'm like the Jiminy Cricket on the project manager's shoulder, sort of, saying, are we doing the right thing? Are we doing the thing right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a great analogy, So I'll just bring in, I think, a comment from Caroline, who says, rather than fixing the scope of the solution, and I think this is asked as a sort of question or comment, but ask the business to fix the scope of the problem to solve, and then you can help them to start to solve that problem within X time frame. So I think when we were talking about some of the challenges with scope and MVP, so that's an interesting angle as well. But I just want to bring in one more question, which is an anonymous question, but I think it's a really good one, which is, where do NFR's non-functional requirements, so things like quality attributes, performance, security, usability, whatever they happen to be, where do NFRs live on a backlog? And I'll add to this that, let's face it, normally people think about functions and features and functions. They don't. We have to prod them a little bit to think about non-functional elements. What do you make of that one?
Oh, I love this subject, and this is actually in our workshop. But really importantly, Scrum does not dictate that user stories are the only currency for backlogs. It says work items. So let's just get that one out of the way. Secondly, the difference between a functional requirement is what it does. Non-functional is how well it does it, and that's really, really important. So non-functional defines the quality characteristics of functionality. However, there are 2 types of non-functional requirement. There's the non-functional requirement that's associated with functionality, and then there's the non-functional requirement that's system-wide. So it might be things about, as you said, accessibility, for instance. Now, non-functional requirements that are system-wide aren't done in an iteration, right? They're considerations that need to be there for the whole of the time. At the beginning, I said that requirements are contractual agreements, and actually in Agile, we don't want contractual agreements. We want collaboration over ideas. The only time we want contractual agreements is actually non-functional system requirements. And those are the things that constrain us. So they might be, things about accessibility, supportability, all of those things. So what do I do with them? I stick them in a separate backlog or a document. Actually, I would actually document non-functional requirements upfront, system-wide non-functional requirements upfront, and I would call it the non-functional requirement for the system. I would then have a heading for them. And as I go into each sprint planning or PI planning, whatever planning you're doing, whatever length of iteration, I would go to that catalogue and I would say, how many of these affect what we're trying to do and need to be considered in this sprint? I would then put them on the backlog and figure out where they sit. Now they're going to sit in a couple of places. They're going to sit under some technical work that needs to be done, which might be a technical story, or they will sit as acceptance criteria against some functional requirement that's being done in that space, in which case they'll be written as acceptance criteria within the functional work itself. But they need to be considered and they shouldn't be forgotten, and they're not user stories.
Absolutely, music to my ears, and also I think
glad you didn't ask me that question.
I think it's also an important thing for us to like really highlight is the fact that, do you know what, there is no law that says you can only write user stories if you're working in Agile. There are times, and yes, you might, but you could use something different, or you could use stuff as well as. There's nothing that says you can't do a prototype, you can't do a wireframe, and I'm sure many of us are. But there is sometimes a little bit of a weird, almost like this sort of fear that, oh my god, if I'm not writing a user story, I'm not being Agile, and it just does. It's weird. But so we're very nearly at the end. Mick and Lynn, tell us about your workshop. And I know, Mick, you've got a session at the conference as well, but tell us about your workshop at the conference. What can people expect to see there?
Well, our workshop is about backlogs, and I think it covers a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today. So it's going to be on, you've got it there. So we're going to talk about how to create a backlog. So how do you start from nothing and how do you get to a backlog? So we'll talk about using things like business use cases and the prioritization that gets you down to what we call user story level. We'll talk about user stories. We'll talk about prioritization. We'll talk about splitting stories, but also decomposing goals as well. So we can use goals, goals to help prioritize which stories go into those things within the backlog. So we can think about creating roadmaps. We're going to cover off definition of ready, definition of done. And I think that's it. And make sure we sit and cover off the agile principles. And I was really refreshing to see in the comments that people say agile is a mindset, and 100% it is a mindset. And actually the values and principles that are laid out in the manifesto of guidance, a lot of the methodologies are really to help you adhere to those values and principles, but people throw away the values and principles and focus on the methodology. And I think that's the wrong way around, really. Focus on the values and principles and let the methodologies help you, and not be a slave to the methods.
Definitely. And then Mick, what maybe you could talk just a little bit about your conference session.
Oh yeah, I've got a session, and it's based around how can beekeeping or elements of beekeeping be used in business analysis. So, and it's taken a look at how honeybees go about like thriving as a complex adaptive system, and what does that mean in the way BAs can go about doing their work. Another thing, obviously, they're bees, we're humans, right? That's the first thing to say. But there are things and things that they do which are useful to understand. So that's that. But yeah, in the Lynn's workshop, I'm hopefully bring a bit of a change perspective to it, and I saw in the few of the questions there's a lot of stuff about teams as well and teamwork, and I think that sometimes gets forgotten about in a lot of this stuff. I've been working on something really interesting around sort of large language models, and the way that they went about trying to solve that is very collaborative, and it's what, like Lynn said, it's not based on role or anything. It was all based on skill and what people could bring to a collaborative team. And I think that's really where we need to get to solve problems.
Fantastic. Well, Lynn, Mick, I mean, thank you so much. We could carry on for probably another hour, but I must let you get on. I'm absolutely certain that people will want to stay in touch with you. They'll want to connect with you. Obviously, and I'd encourage everyone who's on the webinar, go and look at the BA Conference Europe website. In the wrap-up email, there'll be a link to it, but you can just Google BA Conference Europe and you'll find it as well if you're watching the recording. But how can people stay in touch? Is like LinkedIn the best method, or?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. It just says linda.girvan. So find me there. I'm on Twitter as well. So find me. LinkedIn's probably the best place to connect.
Yeah, same for me.
At the conference.
At the conference, yeah.
And at the conference, fantastic. Well, thank you both, Lynn and Mick, for a fantastic session. If you're still on the line, just stay on for just 2 more minutes. I have just one more thing to show you, just in case you haven't seen it, which is, you may or may not be aware of a publication called BA Digest, which is a completely free quarterly PDF business analysis journal, business analysis magazine. You can access it at badigest.link. That's badigest.link. And if you don't need to register or anything like that, literally you can just view it. And it comes out each quarter, and it covers all things BA related. And there are 2 reasons I'm saying this. One is, if you are tuned in and you're thinking, I've got a BA story to tell, I'd really like to write an article, then we would love to hear from you. You don't have to be an experienced author, whatever that means. You just need to have a story to tell. We'll help you. You know, we have editing and the graphic design and stuff that we do. But also, if you are interested in business analysis, go and get a copy, download, get on the mailing list. There's always like 16, 17 articles every quarter to inspire you around business analysis. So do take a look and get involved. And if you're part of a BA team, why not, you know, download it, send it to your colleagues, and maybe even have discussions about the various different topics. So that's badigest.link. If you opted in when you signed up for the webinar, you'll get copies of this sent to you automatically anyway. But we have reached the very end of our allotted time. So once again, Lynn, Mick, thank you so much for such a fantastic for a fantastic webinar. Thank you all for tuning in live or indeed watching the recording. Have a fantastic evening, morning, whatever time of day it is, because we've got folks from all over the world. And good luck taming and maintaining your backlogs, everyone. So excellent. Bye for now, everyone.
Cheers, Adrian.